Welcome to episode 29 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are continuing our Christmas season, where at least one film in our pairing will have a seasonal theme. Though, to be fair, as this week we're talking about anthology movies, it's probably more accurate to say that one of the stories in one of our pairings has a seasonal theme. So first off this week is Dead of Night from 1945, the first British horror movie released after World War II. It was directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, Charles Chricton, Robert Hamer and Basil Dearden, and stars Mervyn Johns, Sally Ann Howes, Googie Withers and Michael Redgrave. Then we head to 1974 and From Beyond the Grave, the final anthology movie released by British studio Amicus. Directed by Kevin Connor, it stars Peter Cushing, Donald Pleasence, Angela Pleasence, David Warner, Ian Bannen, Ian Ogilvy and Diana Dors. Along the way we'll be discussing the history of Ealing Studios, the career of writer R. Chetwynd Hayes, the Amicus anthology horror series, film director Kevin Connor, and much, much more. Before we do any of that though, as always, I'd like to mention the main sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, all of which will of course be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing both movies, I have referred to the books English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema, 1897 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby, and Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film by Peter Hutchings. When discussing the film Dead of Night, I have heavily referenced the book Dead of Night, written by Jess Connolly and David Owen, and published by Devil's Advocates. And I've also referred to articles on bfi.org.uk, thelancet.com, and a documentary called Remembering Dead of Night, which can be found on the Criterion Collection Blu-ray and 4K Special Edition releases. And when discussing From Beyond the Grave, I have heavily referenced a book called British Cult Cinema, the Amicus Anthology by Bruce G. Hallenbach, and a special edition of the magazine Phantasmagoria, which is dedicated to R. Chetwynd Hayes. And finally, I have referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb pages for both movies. All of which brings us on to our first movie of the week, which is, as I mentioned earlier, Dead of Night from 1945 and Ealing Studios, which the British Film Institute has called the most important film in British horror until the beginning of Hammer. Although Ealing Studios only really made one horror movie, which is this one, I am going to spend a few moments discussing the history of the studio, firstly because their output had a huge impact on British cinema, and secondly because I grew up watching a lot of their movies and it gives me an excuse to talk about some of them. Ealing Studios began life in 1902 as Will Barker Studios, when a site in Ealing, West London, was bought by a British film producer, director and entrepreneur named, surprisingly enough, Will Barker. This event marked the birth of British cinema and also makes the studio the oldest continuously working facility for film production in the world. In 1910, it became the location for one of the first film versions of Hamlet, and by 1912, it had become the largest film studio in Britain and quite possibly Europe. In 1929, these studios were purchased by a theatre producer called Basil Dean, who renamed them Ealing Studios in 1931, but then 2 years later changed his mind and renamed them Associated Talking Pictures, or ATP. During this period, the studio produced about 30 movies, many of which were star vehicles for people like Gracie Fields and George Formby, and which had a very broad music hall style tone. But it would appear that whilst Dean was a very accomplished stage producer and director, his talents didn't necessarily extend to cinema. One biographer described his films as inert and with next to no rhythm or comedic flair, while Dean himself developed a reputation for, quote, his complete lack of a sense of humour, end quote. By the late 1930s, his colleagues at the studio had started to feel that Dean was spending far more time in the theatre than on film production, and in 1938, he was encouraged to resign. He was replaced by a producer called Michael Balkan, who had given Alfred Hitchcock his first directing opportunity in 1925 with a film called The Pleasure Garden. He'd also gone on to produce Hitchcock's The Lodger, a story of the London fog, which we spoke about in episode 27. Under his stewardship, the name was reverted back to Ealing Studios, and it became the most famous British film studio in the world, playing host to a team of highly skilled creatives, including directors Basil Dearden, Charles Chricton, Alberto Cavalcanti, and Robert Hammer, all of whom would direct aspects of Dead of Night. Under Balkan's leadership, the studio would produce its most famous movies, many of them comedies made after World War II. These include Whiskey Galore in 1949, Passport to Pimlico, again in 1949, The Lavender Hill Mob in 1951, and The Lady Killers in 1955. All of these are quite now widely regarded as classics of British cinema, and starred a wealth of great British acting talent, including Margaret Rutherford, Alec Guinness, Stanley Holloway, and Peter Sellers, to name just a few. And while all of the films I've just mentioned are favourites of mine, if I had to pick one to recommend, it would be 1955's The Lady Killers. This very black comedy features a gang of bank robbers hiding out in the house of a sweet old lady, played by Katie Johnson, and co-stars Alec Guinness as the magnificently creepy gang leader and Herbert Lom as one of the robbers. It was remade, incredibly badly in my opinion, in 2004 by the Coen brothers, who really should have known better, so please do make sure you stick with the original if you're going to track it down. Balkan ran the studios until 1955, when it was bought by the BBC, who based their film department there. During its peak, 56 different crews were using the studios as a location for filming dramas, documentaries, and other programmes, and it also housed over 50 cutting rooms working on pretty much any genre you could think of. During this time, the studio was home to countless iconic BBC TV shows, including Quatermass and the Pit, Monty Python's Flying Circus, Porridge, Z-Cars, and of course, Doctor Who. In 1993, in a cost-cutting exercise, the BBC sold the studios for £6 million to a company called BBRK, but they sold it again 2 years later, and then in the mid-2000s it was sold yet again. Nevertheless, it continued to function as a working film studio, and also resumed producing its own movies, including the St. Trinian's franchise in 2007 and Dorian Gray in 2009. It's also been used as the filming location for many other productions, including Downton Abbey, The Crown, Bridget Jones's Diary, Shaun of the Dead, Last Night in Soho, and a particular favourite of the podcast, The Descent. Dead of Night is the only horror film produced under the studio's banner, and this is no doubt partly due to the impact of World War II. During this period, the studio, and others in the UK, came under pressure from the government to avoid making films that were too horrifying for a wartime audience. Michael Balkan also wanted to ensure that the studio was producing what he called, quote, films of a character that will be of national use at this time, end quote. And so, needless to say, horror movies were pretty much out of the question. That being said though, horror movies weren't really a mainstay of British film production of the time anyway. Although there were a few notable exceptions, including Boris Karloff in The Ghoul in 1933 and Bela Lugosi in The Dark Eyes of London in 1939, horror had pretty much been left to the Americans and Universal Studios. In fact, it was concern over American horror movies, particularly Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein, that led to the introduction of the British Board of Film Censor's H certificate in 1932. The H stood for horrific and was supposed to indicate films that were, quote, likely to frighten or horrify children under the age of 16 years, end quote. And although it was supposedly an advisory certificate only, many authorities used it to ban under 16s from watching the movies at all. The first British movie to be classified as H was in fact 1939's Dark Eyes of London, and as you can imagine, it was the production of H certificate films that was pretty much suppressed throughout World War II. During this period, Ealing concentrated on home front dramas and wartime propaganda, but that's not to suggest that these were all light and fluffy. A particular favourite of mine is the 1942 propaganda movie Went the Day Well, directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, who was known and billed on film credits simply by his surname. This story, set in the sleepy English village of Bramley End, tells of an attempted undercover invasion by Nazis posing as British troops, aided by a fifth column hoping to overthrow the country from within. It's surprisingly brutal for the period and rather dark at points, and is definitely worth tracking down, particularly if you want to be reminded of a period in history where people understood that Nazis are a bad thing. That's not to say that there was no depiction of the supernatural at all in British cinema. It just came very few and far between, and was usually wrapped in a layer of propaganda. In 1941, the British studio Gainsborough Pictures produced The Ghost Train, an adaptation of a classic stage play which mixed frights and comedy with a subplot about fifth columnists and wartime smuggling. If you can get past the wince-making performance of Arthur Askey, and trust me, it's quite a difficult performance to get past, then there's quite a lot in that one to enjoy as well. And then in 1943, towards the end of the war, Ealing began filming a supernatural fantasy called The Halfway House, which was then released a year later in 1944. In this, a group of characters experience a time slip while visiting an inn in rural Wales, and take the opportunity to turn their lives around and face the future with renewed courage. It features Mervyn Johns and Sally Ann Howes, both of whom would go on to appear in Dead of Night, and was also directed by Basil Dearden, who would also direct aspects of the later film. In this sense, The Halfway House can be seen as a forerunner to Dead of Night in many ways, though it is much lighter in tone and doesn't set out to terrify the viewer, which Dead of Night most definitely did. And we can certainly assume that the experience of making The Halfway House and the satisfaction with the final product encouraged the studio to move even further into the supernatural, as they went into pre-production on Dead of Night before the war was actually over, albeit they chose to describe it as a psychological thriller rather than a horror film. As the movie was released less than a month after VJ Day on August the 15th, we can assume that the project had been initiated at least as early as 1944, or possibly even earlier. Although it's set in contemporary Britain, there are no explicit references to the war in either its individual stories or wraparound narrative, something that more than a few people have commented on. Being blunt, this is hardly surprising, given the lives lost and the trauma of war, as well as the austerity and displacement that lingered afterwards. Audiences would have been looking for escapism rather than social realism, and one can hardly blame the Ealing team for going for the former. The mood of the time is probably best summed up by the writer George Orwell, who said in 1944, quote, "I overhear very little discussion of the wider issues of war. Everyone wants, above all things, a rest." End quote. That being said, though, it is worth noticing the picture that appears beneath the movie's opening credits, which is a painting by Henry Moore called Figure in a Shelter. This is one of a series of paintings and sketches that were commissioned by the War Artists Advisory Committee to capture images of England under siege, and is one of many that Moore made which captured images of Britain sleeping and sheltering from the bombing raids. And so while the war might not be explicitly mentioned in the film, it is still there. It opens with an image of someone sheltering from a living nightmare, as opposed to the metaphorical one that we experience in the film. And now we're getting into spoilers, so if you haven't seen Dead of Night yet, as always, it's either time to press pause and come back when you have, or at the very least to approach the rest of the episode with caution. The intention of the film and the inspiration for it was described by Michael Balkan in his 1969 biography, A Lifetime of Films. Quote, "We decided that it would be a good idea to make a series of ghost stories, joined by a suitable central story thread that would display the all-round talents of the creative teams we had built up, and it was from this decision that Dead of Night was born." End quote. This then is an anthology movie, known more properly as a portmanteau film, a series of stories linked by an overarching plot device. The stories themselves concern a premonition of death, a haunting at a Christmas party, a haunted mirror, a golfing story, and finally perhaps the most famous of them all, the story of a ventriloquist dummy that may or may not have a mind of its own. Initially, the team had the 5 main stories and the directing talent that would produce each one, but the linking narrative proved somewhat elusive. The solution came from screenwriter Angus MacPhail, who had already co-written the screenplay for The Halfway House. And in my personal opinion, unlike many other films of its type, here it is the linking story itself which makes the film so impressive, setting up an additional mystery and sense of unease that many other anthology movies have attempted and quite often failed to achieve. The film opens with our nominal protagonist, Walter Craig, played by Mervyn Johns, who, as I mentioned earlier, appeared in the movie The Halfway House in 1944 and also appeared in the wartime propaganda movie Went the Day Well in 1942. Born in Wales in 1899, he was a mainstay of British cinema during World War II and beyond, with over 100 film, stage and TV credits to his name between the years of 1923 and 1979. He was known for portraying, quote, mostly mild-mannered, lugubrious, amusing, and sometimes moving little men, end quote, and is frequently hailed as one of Ealing Studio's most prolific actors. And as late as September 2022, which was 30 years after his death, he was named the 40th most popular Welsh actor of all time. We meet him here driving his car down a country lane as he arrives at Pilgrim's Farm, a location he has never visited before, but with which he seems far too familiar. When he is greeted by the host, Elliot Foley, he immediately knows that there is one living room, and despite the fact that he says, "I've never been here before," not actually, he is able to find the hidden coat rack and also predicts that the barn conversion has, quote-unquote, every modern convenience. This portrayal of déjà vu raises a sense of curiosity in the audience, but this is quickly replaced by a sense of unease, as the score by George Auric swells menacingly in the background. Ushering his guest into the living room, Elliot Foley says he expects they've started tea, to which Walter Craig ominously responds, "Yes. Yes, they have." As the film progresses, we learn the reason that Craig knows so much about this location is that he might not have been here in person, but he's been here in his dreams, or more accurately, he's been here in a nightmare, but unfortunately, it's one that he can barely remember. And whilst this narrative explains why the occupants of Pilgrim's Farm decide to share their own stories of the bizarre and supernatural, it also allows segment director Basil Dearden to build an incredible sense of menace, creating more than just a framing narrative, but an additional story in and of itself. So between each of the individual segments, we return to the drawing room, where an increasingly confused and terrified Craig starts to piece together moments from his nightmare, something that he eloquently compares to being outside in a storm at night. This creates more than a little creeping dread as Craig begins to predict events that are yet to happen, the arrival of a penniless brunette and the death of a man that he doesn't know, as well as his growing certainty that he is being driven to commit something unutterably evil. This scenario also allows for some quite nice moments of meta-commentary. Elliot's elderly mother, played by Mary Merrill, refers to them all as being characters in a supernatural drama, which of course they are, while Joan, played by Googie Withers, suggests, quote, "None of us exist at all. We are only characters in Mr. Craig's dream," end quote, which again turns out to be perfectly true, initially at least. The framing narrative is directed by Basil Dearden, who had directed The Halfway House and would also direct the first story, called simply enough The Hearse Driver. This is based on a story by E.F. Benson, who we mentioned very briefly last week as a fellow member of the Cambridge Chit Chat Society alongside M.R. James. This story was also used as the basis for an episode of The Twilight Zone titled 22 that was televised in 1961. Despite the fact that this segment is little more than a sketch, It is this one, though, which stayed with me the most when I saw the movie as a child, and it gave me endless nightmares and childhood notions that were I to look out of a window late at night, I too would see a phantom hearse driver, ominously recounting that there's just room for one inside, sir. Miles Mellison, who plays the hearse driver and the later bus conductor, is not a very scary-looking individual, even sitting on top of a hearse wearing mourning clothes. But the way that he is introduced is quite brilliantly done, and I have no doubt that it was this, rather than the actor himself, that scared me so much as a kid. In the scene, we are in the hospital room of Hugh Granger, a race car driver who has narrowly escaped death. After some rather dubious flirting with the nurse in charge of his care, he settles down for the night. A radio is playing softly in the background, and we are told that it is 10:15. As he reads in bed, though, the radio suddenly stops, and we are left with the ticking of a clock, an amplified sound that very soon will also fall silent. The camera slowly zooms in on the curtains, and Granger looks at his bedside clock, which now reads a very different time. All is quiet. Granger gets out of bed, and a low-angle shot frames his shadow against the curtains. We are suddenly uneasy, but we don't know why. He pulls back the curtains, and it is suddenly daylight, and as he glances at the courtyard below, George Aurich's score suddenly breaks the silence, and an overhead zoom closes in on Mallison's face as he winks directly at the camera and utters his ominous line. And just before we go any further, I think this is an appropriate time to mention the score and also the lighting, which combine beautifully in this segment and also throughout the film, and to which it owes much of its impact. From the opening swirl of the theme music, which suggests the nightmarish vortex into which we're soon going to descend, the score combines orchestral strings and brass to build suspense and create moments of abject horror. This is not just in the appearance of the hearse driver, it also happens in the visions of the haunted room in the third story, and the final descent into madness that we experience at the climax. This all came courtesy of George Aurich, a musical prodigy who had already composed and orchestrated the music for several ballets and stage productions before he even reached the age of 20. Associated with fellow composer Eric Satie and avant-garde polymath Jean Cocteau, he would go on to compose the soundtracks for many other Ealing movies, including The Lavender Hill Mob, The Titfield Thunderbolt, and Hue and Cry. In 1949, he also composed the score for another British supernatural drama, The Queen of Spades, which we'll be covering in the new year, and very importantly for our series, the 1961 movie, The Innocents. As well as the score, the terrifying nature of the hearse driver is also greatly amplified by the lighting design that precedes his appearance, with Granger's bed illuminated on one side of the frame and his shadow projected onto the curtains on the other. This was created by director of photography Douglas Slocum and lighting cameraman Stan Pavey, working in tandem to create a look that is not quite film noir and not quite expressionism, but lies somewhere in between. Making extensive use of low-key lighting and high contrast, the film becomes more claustrophobic as it continues, the once warm and welcoming parlour of Pilgrim's Farm becoming darker between each story, seeming to close in on its occupants. This only serves to emphasise the trap in which Walter Craig finds himself, unable to leave despite his attempt at the midway point, with the shadows of chairs and banisters anticipating the jail cell that we see towards the end. By the time that the generator dies and he is left alone with Dr. Van Straten in the firelight, the room is overrun with looming shadows, becoming all the more pronounced as the camera tilts into Dutch angles and strange perspectives. And D.P. Douglas Slocum would go on to demonstrate his considerable talents in many films over the following decades. He worked on the first 3 Indiana Jones movies for Steven Spielberg and was also nominated for an Oscar for cinematography on 3 separate occasions. The appearance of the hearse driver then unnerved me greatly as a child back in the 1970s, partly for the reasons just outlined, but also because the Benson story was not just a figment of his very creative imagination. It is supposedly based on a true haunting and a story collected by Peter Underwood, the president of the Ghost Club. The Ghost Club was founded in 1862 and is believed to be the oldest paranormal investigation and research organisation in the world. Its members have included the writers Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Algernon Blackwood, Robert Aikman, Dennis Wheatley and Maurice Grosse, the actual proper investigator of the so-called Enfield poltergeist, regardless of what the Conjuring movies might try to tell you. In the Ghost Club's collection of supposedly true hauntings, they recount the tale of Lord Dufferin, a story that was also published in 1970's kid favourite reference book, The Beaver Book of Horror, which is where I first encountered it at about the same time as seeing this movie. So I'm just going to read directly from it here. Quote, "After spending an enjoyable evening at a friend's house party in Tullamore, Lord Dufferin went up to his bedroom. He felt at peace with the world. There was a comforting wood fire in the grate, and he decided to read a little before going to sleep. After half an hour, he felt curiously restless and put the book down. Then he dozed fitfully. Usually Lord Dufferin slept well, but at 2 o'clock he got out of bed and crossed to the window. It was a cloudless night with a full moon, and everything was still. Then suddenly something caught his eye, and he watched fascinated as a figure stepped out from the shadows and walked slowly across the lawn, carrying a large box on his back. He stopped when he was opposite the bedroom window and stared up at Lord Dufferin. The moon lit the man's face. Their eyes met, and Lord Dufferin moved back instinctively. He described the man's face later as full of horror and malevolence. As the man turned away and disappeared, Lord Dufferin realised that the box he was carrying was a coffin. The house was quiet as death, and he returned to bed. When he came down to breakfast the next morning, Lord Dufferin told everyone about his adventure. They had a good laugh, and his friend assured him that the house had no history of ghosts. Sure enough, on further visits, Lord Dufferin slept in the same bedroom, and nothing happened. And was that all? No. Years later, when he had been appointed ambassador to France, Lord Dufferin waited at the lift of a Paris hotel, where he was going to address a conference on the 5th floor. The lift came down, the doors opened, people came out and others went in, including Lord Dufferin, who was busy in conversation. Suddenly he looked up and noticed the lift man. He stepped back, appalled. It was the face he had seen in Ireland, the face of the man who carried the coffin on his back. He waved the lift away, and the doors closed. A few moments later, as it reached the 5th floor, there was a sharp noise, followed by a dreadful crash which shook the hotel. The suspension cable had snapped, and the lift had plunged to the bottom of the shaft, killing 5 of the people in it, including the lift man. Who was the lift man? Lord Dufferin wanted to know, but curiously enough, no one could tell him. He had replaced the regular lift man only that morning. The hotel had no idea who he was and never discovered where he came from. Yet, by some strange trick of time, he had saved Lord Dufferin's life. End quote. Unlike Lord Dufferin, in this story, Granger has a psychotherapist on hand to rationalise his premonition, and his Freudian approach to the situation is a theme that runs throughout the movie. When Walter Craig arrives at Pilgrim's Farm, we meet Dr. Van Straten, a psychoanalyst who attempts to treat Craig's delusions, while also providing perfectly rational explanations for the stories told by the other guests. These include that they are the result of subconscious word association, or even what he calls quote-unquote crypto-amnesia, something that he then incorrectly defines as what we would now know as folie à deux. Whether this is deliberate on the part of the writers or a simple mistake is unclear, but to be specific, crypto-amnesia is when a forgotten memory, idea or thought is believed to be a new and original one. So whilst it can hardly be used to explain Joan's story of the haunted mirror, it may perfectly well explain some of the films of Quentin Tarantino. As well as Dr. Van Straten and Granger's therapist, who explains the vision of the hearse driver as a psychological crisis, We also have Peter in the Haunted Mirror segment worrying about his sanity, and Maxwell Freer in the ventriloquist story demonstrating either possession or dissociative identity disorder, depending on your point of view. With its frequent reference to analysis, ventriloquist dummies, repetition of events, and the blurring of fantasy and reality, Dead of Night has frequently been described as a tribute to Freud's 1919 theory of the uncanny, a work that also inspired the more recent film Possum, which we discussed back in episode 3. As I mentioned earlier, in this film the war isn't explicitly mentioned, but more than one commentator has suggested that Dead of Night is possibly, in and of itself, an exploration of the trauma of conflict and its residual damage. Even the British medical journal The Lancet has said as much, going to describe the movie as a psychoanalytic film. It's probably worth mentioning, though, that just a few months after this, Hitchcock would release his movie Spellbound, which again features psychoanalysis and dream interpretation as its central themes. Freud and his theories were very much in vogue at the time, and so it's probably not surprising that Dead of Night included them in its many narratives. After all, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. The inclusion of the various therapists also sets up an interesting debate between science and the supernatural, a discourse that has been explored several times by other movies in this series. Here the world of science is personified by Dr. Van Straten, though it must be admitted that even he concedes defeat in the end and confesses to believing in Walter Craig's premonitions. Other characters are either politely skeptical, like Elliot Foley, or fall down firmly on the side of the paranormal. Penniless brunette Joyce, who arrives bang on schedule and unable to pay for her taxi, criticises the other house guests as ridiculously weak-minded for letting Dr. Van Straten walk all over them, and Sally O'Hara describes him as a doubting Thomas, and goes on to say that she has had a few subconscious thingamajigs herself. This leads us into our second story, set at Christmas, and the reason for this film's inclusion in our seasonal run of movies, and its inclusion on various lists for alternative Christmas films. Sally is played by Sally Ann Howes, who would go on to portray Truly Scrumptious in the children's classic Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and as I mentioned earlier, she also appeared in The Halfway House. Her segment is a quietly melancholy ghost story, set at a Christmas party in a country estate, where she avoids the attention of the rather annoying Jimmy Watson, only to run into a very lonely child ghost. This segment, directed by Alberto Cavalcanti, has hints of a classic Christmas ghost story called Smee, written by the writer A.M. Burridge in 1931, which also features a haunting during a game of sardines. In fact, though, it is actually based on a real murder case, the 1865 murder of Francis Kent by his half-sister Constance. This case was a media sensation of the time, and was also recounted by the writer Kate Summerscale in her book The Murder at Road Hill House, published in 2009. This would go on to be dramatised on British TV as The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, starring the always brilliant Paddy Considine in the title role, and it's well worth watching if you get the opportunity. As I've mentioned before, this podcast is really about horror and maybe social history as opposed to true crime, so I'm not going to go too much into the case here. But suffice it to say, 16-year-old Constance was indeed convicted of the murder of her 5-year-old half-brother, and although she was initially sentenced to death, this was commuted to life imprisonment. As well as this story, and the works just mentioned, The People, Crime and Trial also formed the inspiration for the Wilkie Collins novel The Moonstone, the book The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens, and an episode of the 1980s BBC TV series A Question of Guilt. Here, the story has a somewhat happy ending, if such a thing is possible, as the ghost of Francis assures Sally that having met her he will now be able to sleep, suggesting that her gentle kindness and affection has laid his unquiet spirit to rest. And this is something that is underlined when he tells her goodbye in response to her bidding him a good night. According to some reports, when the film was released in the US, this story, along with the golfing story, was removed altogether to create a shorter runtime and was only reinserted in later restorations. Being honest, I can completely understand why the golfing story would be excluded. In fact, in many ways, I applaud the decision. But to lose this one, I think, was a shame. If nothing else, the decision only served to confuse the framing structure and the nightmarish climax. Following this story, we return to the drawing room at Pilgrim's Farm and are provided a brief comic respite in the form of Sally's mother. We've already had some light relief in the form of another mother, Mrs. Foley, who gets terribly confused trying to explain the situation to Joyce. But in Sally's mother, we get a full force of nature. She is described as being most memorable by the Doctor and mistakes these supernatural conversations for a game of charades, suggesting that Mr. Craig hit someone else savagely instead of her daughter. Played by Barbara Leake, Mrs. O'Hara represents a very British type of comedy figure, a brusque and overbearing presence that anticipates many a later sitcom character, from Margot Ledbetter in The Good Life to Hyacinth Bouquet in Keeping Up Appearances. And had the Ealing team kept the comedy here, I think it would have led to a far superior overall experience. But sadly, it was deemed necessary to include something even broader in the fourth story. But we'll come on to that shortly. From here, we move on to a story that anticipates at least two of the segments in our second movie, From Beyond the Grave. While the Hearst story was based on the work of E.F. Benson, and possibly a real haunting, and the Christmas story was based on a real-life murder case, The Haunted Mirror is a completely original narrative, written by John V. Baines and directed by Robert Hamer, here making his directorial debut. Originally hired by Ealing as an editor, he would go on to direct several of their later movies, including the 1945 murder thriller Pink String and Sealing Wax, which would reunite him with Googie Withers and Mervyn Johns, and Kind Hearts and Coronets in 1949. Reported as saying, quote, "I want to make films about people in dark rooms, doing beastly things to each other," end quote, he sadly never lived up to the promise of his early work, and his career has been described as, quote, "the most serious miscarriage of talent in post-war British cinema," end quote. A gay man living in a time where being gay was illegal and would result in imprisonment, he also suffered from alcoholism, and it would seem a rather natural connection to link the two, though this, I have to say, is my opinion and is unsubstantiated. It is, however, interesting to view this segment through this lens, particularly given the gender politics that are on pretty clear display throughout. Up until this point, the character of Joan, played by the marvellously named Googie Withers, has come across as a rather sympathetic character, but as we enter her story, we start to see a shift in her personality. Here she is bossy and domineering, and appears far more interested in her upcoming wedding than she is in her fiancé Peter's mental health. Admittedly, mental well-being was not particularly high on the agenda in the 1940s, particularly for men, but her lack of interest, until things begin to affect her directly, is rather startling. Not only that, but she admits to enjoying having men on a string, something that Peter describes as pleasing her, quote, "disgusting feminine vanity," end quote. The other man that she apparently has on a string, Guy, is never seen, but from the description of his character he seems rather queer-coded, leading Peter to suggest she would be better off with a spaniel, to which she responds, quote, "Yes, but spaniels don't have nice comfortable Bentleys, do they?" End quote. If this was all there was, we could put it down to being a sign of the era in which the film was made. But the theme is further compounded by the depiction of Peter, a man who suggests that a good night out is to dress up and spend lots of money, and who effectively turns into damsel in distress, needing to be rescued by his now wife as he falls deeper and deeper into the haunted room in the mirror. And it's probably worth remembering that this is a gift she has given him because, she says, she thought he might like to look at himself. It's also been pointed out by more than a few commentators that, apart from a dinner date with Joan, Peter never seems to leave their home. Joan comes and goes quite freely, but he essentially becomes a bedridden invalid, and even after the mirror is destroyed, it is Joan who comforts Peter rather than the other way round. "I seem to have cut myself," is all he actually says. And I think it's worth taking a moment here to appreciate the art direction, evidenced throughout the film in the styling of Pilgrim's Farm and the preceding stories, but greatly emphasised here in the depiction of the haunted room. The art director was Michael Ralph, who began his career aged just 17, working as an assistant art director for British Gaumont Studios. He moved to Ealing in 1942, and the drawings he created for the Dead of Night set designs show an incredible eye for detail and breadth of design, and these are reproduced in the Devil's Advocates book that I used for research, which I mentioned at the beginning. But even without these images, we just have to look at the juxtaposition of Peter's minimalist and sterile apartment with the luxurious furnishings reflected in the mirror to see exactly what I mean. When we return to Pilgrim's Farm, the mood has shifted to something much darker. The previous stories might have had their moments, but they were still relatively light. But by now, the film has started to shift into horror. And this is quite clearly displayed by the rather ghoulish description provided by the antique dealer when he describes the tragedy at Marsden Lacey. Quote, "He sat in front of the mirror, your mirror, and slit his throat." End quote. Something that many other critics have also noticed is that the haunted mirror sequence, along with the uninvited from 1944, is one of the first times that ghosts and spirits were depicted in cinema as being malevolent. No wonder then that the room is now much darker and seems to have reduced in size, an effect that will continue as the rest of the movie progresses. What a pity then, at least in my opinion, that this momentum is broken by the insertion of the golfing story, directed by Charles Chricton, and which I could quite frankly do without. The intent of the filmmakers, though, is clear. In fact, one could go so far as to say that they are represented in the film by Elliot Foley, who, seeing the sheer terror and panic on Watercraig's face, decides to break the mood with something more light-hearted. Perhaps Ealing Studios felt exactly the same way, and fearful of going too far during this time in history, decided to pull back more than a little. Regardless of the intention, personally, the broad comedy ruins the sense of mounting horror and dread that has been so carefully constructed, and so, as far as I'm concerned, the less said about it, the better. And with that in mind, let's quickly move on. Our final story, before we return to the completion of Watercraig's Nightmare, is the one about the ventriloquist dummy, the second story directed by Alberto Cavalcanti. Although I had always assumed that this movie was the first to depict a relationship between a ventriloquist and his doll, it had by all accounts been done before. In 1929, Erich von Stroheim starred in a film called The Great Gabbo, a film that also, incidentally, inspired a Simpsons character of the same name. That being said, though, it would appear that Dead of Night was the first to bring this narrative into the world of the horror film and to suggest a possibly supernatural relationship. This is something, of course, that has now become fully embedded in the public consciousness, even to the point of being somewhat of a cliché. Since the release of the film, we have seen endless episodes of The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Crypt, Goosebumps, and also films including Dead Silence, Devil Doll, and of course the Anthony Hopkins movie, Magic. Given this overfamiliarity, I think it's probably fair to say that this segment, which was undoubtedly terrifying and chilling in 1945, may have lost some of its edge, though it is enlivened enormously by a powerhouse performance from Michael Redgrave as the incredibly troubled puppeteer Maxwell Freer. His performance was singled out by the critic Pauline Kael, who wrote, quote, "Michael Redgrave plays a schizophrenic ventriloquist tormented by his dummy, and his overpowering performance, a small work of art, lifts this 5-part English production above the elegant and sophisticated entertainment it aspires to be." End quote. Without downplaying the efforts of the rest of the cast, she probably has a point. His sweaty desperation and obsessive jealousy is mesmerising, and is a testament to the extensive research that he undertook in preparing for the role. Most widely known for his role as the romantic lead in Alfred Hitchcock's 1938 movie The Lady Vanishes, his performance in this movie would no doubt have been a shock to contemporary viewers. According to Devil's Advocates, he took the role because he had admired Erich von Stroheim in The Great Gabbo, but he had also long been fascinated by the art of ventriloquism. He spent very long hours studying the physicality required to portray Freer, working with colleagues from his days as a theatre actor and also with the ventriloquist Peter Brough, who, rather bizarrely in hindsight, used to perform a ventriloquist act on the radio. This story has been described as a love triangle between Freer, Hugo Fitch and the American Sylvester Key, suggesting that the doll represents Freer's own suppressed desires, essentially taking on a life of their own and ultimately leading to his destruction. Then again though, Hugo could indeed be animated by supernatural means. There is, after all, no real explanation for how he ends up in some of the places that he does. Regardless, he is magnificently creepy, far more so than Corky from the 1978 movie Magic, particularly his sneering and high-pitched vocal tones, provided not by Michael Redgrave, but by an uncredited actor named John Maguire. Another relationship that's also worth mentioning here is the suggested dalliance between Sylvester Key and the nightclub owner Beulah, played by Elizabeth Welch. It might not be stated outright that they've had a relationship, but it is certainly hinted at, and in his biography of Welch, the writer Stephen Bourne picks up on this, saying, quote, "Though easily missed, this is nonetheless the closest any English language film had come to suggesting a racially mixed relationship between a woman of African descent and a white man." End quote. Following this story, we return to Pilgrim's Farm and the climax of the movie. I've made the decision not to discuss this in any great detail, but needless to say, the monstrous act of evil that Walter Craig has been predicting does indeed come to pass, and then the narrative twists into a cacophony of Dutch angles, monstrous close-ups, and the truly horrifying return of Hugo Fitch. This climax incorporates elements of the preceding stories with some new nightmare scenarios of its own, and is one that lingers long after the credits are over, not least Mervyn Johns' ominous line, "Oh doctor, why did you have to break your glasses?" On its release in 1945, the film was critically acclaimed, with reviewers praising its sophistication, innovative structure, and very unsettling atmosphere. In terms of box office, it proved a solid commercial success, and finished the year as a runner-up in the British box office charts. Over time, it has become quite rightly recognised as a classic of British horror cinema, and an inspiration to many of the anthology movies that would follow, most notably those from the studios of Amicus, including our second film this week, From Beyond the Grave. But before we move on to that very movie, I do think it's also worth mentioning a very unusual legacy for Dead of Night. This is its influence on cosmological theory and the development of a so-called steady-state model of an unchanging universe, which was posited in 1948 by an astronomer called Fred Hoyle. After Hoyle and two of his colleagues watched Dead of Night, they asked themselves the question, what if the universe is really like that? And whilst the notion was initially rejected, the three astrophysicists found it difficult to dismiss, with one of them later writing, quote, "Dinner was a little late that night, and before long, we all said that this was a very possible solution." And at least as far as I can ascertain, Dead of Night is a horror movie that stands alone in its claims to have influenced theories of astrophysics and the meaning of the universe. Unless of course you count killer clowns from outer space. All of which does indeed bring us on to our second movie of the week, which is From Beyond the Grave, released in 1974 from British studio Amicus Productions. It was directed by Kevin Connor and stars David Warner, Ian Bannen, Diana Dors, Donald Pleasence, Angela Pleasence, and Ian Ogilvy. From Beyond the Grave is based on stories by English horror writer R. Chetwynd Hayes, a name with which many listeners may not be entirely familiar, unless you grew up in Great Britain in the 1970s. Those of us of that generation may be a little more cognizant with the name, if not his actual writing, as in addition to his own stories, he was also the editor of several horror and ghost story collections, including 11 volumes of the Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories, 6 volumes of the Armada Monster Book, and regional collections, Cornish Tales of Terror, Scottish Tales of Terror, and, rounding off the trilogy, Welsh Tales of Terror, all of which were published in the early 1970s. Despite all this though, he is certainly not as well remembered as many of his contemporaries, which is a real shame, as although his work might feel a little old-fashioned to a modern reader, he certainly knew how to tell a story. So I hope that this episode may go a little way towards redressing the balance. One of the reasons that I really enjoy creating this podcast alongside talking about films which I particularly like is that I learn a lot about the subjects that I'm discussing, and in the process often have my preconceived ideas completely overturned. I have to say that growing up, the rather stately name R. Chetwynd Hayes conjured up an image of a somewhat portly man sitting in a grand country home and writing stories by the fire as he drank a glass of port, and to my chagrin, this is a presupposition that has stayed with me until I began preparing this episode. And, as it turns out, it really couldn't have been further from the truth. He was named Ronald Henry Glenn Chetwynd Hayes and was born in the London suburb of Isleworth, Middlesex. He was the son of a woman called Rosemary Cooper, who lived with a man called Henry Chetwynd Hayes, who, despite not being the boy's biological father, raised him as his own. Henry was a cinema manager, and through him, Ronald developed a love of cinema, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and that would also inform some of his later career choices, when he appeared as an extra in several British films, including A Yank at Oxford in 1938 and Goodbye Mr. Chips in 1939. Before this, however, young Ronald's life was touched by tragedy when his mother died of tuberculosis at the very young age of 32, and Ronald and his brother Len were split up and sent to foster care. Len would be fostered, and Ron would move in with his grandmother, and then, after her death, an aunt. The two brothers would remain separated for years, although I'm happy to say they did find each other again in later life, and became very firm friends. In 1939, shortly after appearing as an extra in Goodbye Mr. Chips, he joined the British Army at the outbreak of World War II, during which time he took part in the Normandy landings on D-Day. In 1946, after he was demobilised from the army, he worked first as a salesman at Harrods and then in various department stores, including one that sold built-in furniture. In the evenings, he wrote short stories and made his first sale in 1953 to a magazine called The Lady, with a short story titled The Orator. In 1959, he published his first novel, a science fiction story called The Man from the Bomb, and from which he earned just £25, which would be worth about £860 today. As with most writers, he grew used to a steady stream of rejection from publishers, and this led him to pivot his career into the world of the macabre. In a later interview, he describes his thought process as follows. Quote, "I used to try to write the great novel, to be another Bronte, but of course nobody wanted to publish it. Then when I looked at the bookstores and saw all these supernatural titles, I thought that was obviously the market to aim for. I'd always been interested in the supernatural anyway." End quote. 5 years later, and after 19 rejections, in 1964 he published his second novel, a story about reincarnation called The Dark Man. This was published in the States under the more gothic romance title of And Love Survives, a change that would turn out to be fairly successful, as the book did rather well. This was the first of his works to feature his fictional location of Clavering Grange, a stately home dating back to the Elizabethan period and said to be England's most haunted house. He would revisit this location in several later works, and it's also the home of Sir Michael Sinclair, the ghostly character that we meet in The Door, the fourth story in From Beyond the Grave. Clavering Grange would also feature in two of his later novels, The King's Ghost, published in 1985, and The Haunted Grange, published in 1988. Following the publication of The Dark Man, he started selling short stories to anthology series, including the Pan Book of Horror Stories. This was a series of publications with increasingly garish covers that would grace the bookshelves of many a household in the 1970s and early 1980s, my own included. And then in 1971, he published his own collection called The Unbidden, which he would follow with multiple collections with titles including Cold Terror, The Elemental, The Night Ghouls, and Tales of Fear and Fantasy. He also took over editing the series The Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories, a position that had previously been held by Ghost Club member Robert Aikman. And by this time, he also earned himself a nickname, Britain's Prince of Chill. These days, that name would probably be more suitable to somebody who dabbles in electronica and recreational narcotics, but it was given to him due to his combination of horror and humour which permeated his stories and his seeming omnipresence in the British bookstores. In those days, everything to do with the supernatural sold, he said, and at one time I had 6 volumes with my name on them in all of the bookshops. All of this was while he was still working as a sales assistant, demonstrating furniture to customers by day and crafting incredibly British horror stories at night. And it was around this time that his work attracted the attention of a man called Kevin Connor. Kevin Connor was a film editor who had begun his career working on documentaries before moving on to sound editing for directors including Richard Attenborough, Tony Richardson, and Richard Lester. But after editing for several years, he felt he wanted more of a challenge and thought that a move into production might be the way forward, saying in a later interview, quote, "I was always reading for potential film material and came across some excellent short stories in The Unbidden by Ronald Chetwynd Hayes. I thought that they would make a good TV series, all modern day and not too expensive. Through the publisher, I found Ronald and negotiated an option for 12 of the stories. As I recall, he lived alone in a basement flat in Richmond. He was the sweetest, kindest man you would ever wish to meet, and here he was turning out these macabre stories. With 2 friends, Robin Clark and Raymond Christodoulou, we took 4 stories each and wrote up a series. Unfortunately, nobody in the TV world at that time was ready for horror." End quote. But fortunately for Connor, in 1972, the adaptations landed on the desk of Milton Subotsky, one of the men who had co-founded Amicus Productions. This was a company that had already released a number of horror anthology movies, and they were on the lookout for new material. Founded in the early 1960s and quite literally run out of a shed at Shepperton Film Studios, Amicus was essentially a cheap and cheerful rival to Hammer Studios, and indeed used many of the same actors. But while Hammer traded mostly in the Gothic, Amicus had a far more modern outlook, setting their stories in contemporary Britain and bringing horror straight into suburbia. As the BFI website puts it, their movies, quote, "capture the 1970s in all of their colourful, grimy, garish detail. Many of the studio's strongest films feel like an absurd snapshot of Britain in the period." End quote. Their early movies were an attempt to cash in on 1960s pop culture, including the 1962 musical comedy It's Trad Dad, which was the feature debut of director Richard Lester, and he's probably best known these days for his work on Superman 2, when he was brought in to replace original director Richard Donner. Amicus followed this with other lightweight teen-based movies, before starting the series of anthologies which would make their name, and a legacy that lasts even today. And there can be little doubt that this series was inspired by our first movie, Dead of Night, a film that Milton Subotsky regarded as the greatest horror film ever made. Subotsky and his business partner Max Rosenberg had already dabbled in the horror genre with the 1960 movie City of the Dead, released in the US as Horror Hotel. Although this was made under the name of Vulcan Films, it is widely regarded as an Amicus movie in all but name, and stars Christopher Lee, Valentine Dial, and Patricia Jessel. With this movie under their belt, it's little surprise that they eventually turned to the horror market, and in 1965 they released their first anthology film, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. This is a series of 5 stories, each concerning a different passenger from a group sharing a train compartment. Despite some rather mixed reviews, the film was a great success, particularly for a low-budget studio run out of a shed, and it provided a formula to which Amicus would return multiple times over the following decade. There had, of course, been other anthology movies between Dead of Night and Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. For example, there is an excellent film called 3 Cases of Murder from 1955 that's currently available to watch on YouTube. This features a fantastically dark opening story, as well as an appearance from Orson Welles, and I would highly recommend it. There was also Tales of Terror from Roger Corman in 1962, Twice Told Tales in 1963, and in the same year Black Sabbath from Italy and Mario Bava, which features Boris Karloff, and a truly terrifying story about a nurse who tries to steal the ring of a dead woman. A year later, there would also be Kaidan from Japan, quite possibly one of the most beautiful anthology movies ever made. This uses very lavish sets and sound stages to tell 4 folk stories, and if you've never seen it, it's currently available to watch on Amazon Prime and is definitely worth your time. But despite this, it is the Amicus anthology movies that really define the genre, for my generation at least. They followed Dr. Terror with Torture Garden in 1967, The House That Dripped Blood in 1971, Tales from the Crypt and Asylum in 1972, Vault of Horror in 1973, and finally From Beyond the Grave in 1974. Admittedly, some of these are a rather mixed bag, but the beauty of an anthology movie is, of course, if you're not gripped by one story, you only have to wait about 15 minutes for another one to come along. These films also featured cast lists that were bursting at the seams with 1960s and 70s acting talent, including Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Joan Collins, Ralph Richardson, Donald Sutherland, Charlotte Rampling, Britt Ekland, and Burgess Meredith, to name just a few. 2 of those movies were, as you probably realised, based on the American EC comics of the same name. Tales from the Crypt, which features Joan Collins and a psychopathic Santa, now there's a Christmas movie for you, had been a huge success, but the follow-up, Vault of Horror, had underperformed significantly at the US box office. Regardless, Amicus managed to arrange a distribution deal with Warner and Columbia, and when Connor met with Milton Subotsky at Warner Studios, he was told that not only were they interested in 4 of the stories he had adapted, they wanted Connor to direct them himself. Although Connor had never directed before, Subotsky simply told him that editors make good directors, and surrounding him with their top technical talent, sent him off to make the movie. As we can see, filmmaking was clearly a very different world in the 1970s. What a shame it's not like that anymore. The film went into pre-production with the title Tales from Beyond the Grave, clearly designed to link it with the previous movie Tales from the Crypt. In 1972, the title was changed to The Undead, and eventually it went into production at Shepperton Studios in 1973. But although Chetwynd Hayes had initially been excited about the prospect of a film being made from his works, he was rather confused about the production itself, saying in a later interview, quote, "When I was informed that Milton Subotsky was considering making a film based on 4 of my stories, I was over the moon. I thought, gosh, a film, my fortune is made." Only it wasn't. I still don't know why Milton employed several screenwriters. I could have done the job in a single morning. End quote. And although there is nothing wrong at all with the screen versions of the stories, Chetwynd Hayes may have had a point, as his tales tend to be written in a very visual and filmic style, something that was noted by writer Raymond Christodoulou, who said of the project, quote, "Adapting the stories was not as difficult as I had imagined, because Chetwynd Hayes wrote in a very cinematic way. His characters, though complex and mysterious, never internalized for entire chapters, nor were they particularly verbose. A simple action or words spoke volumes. Like any writer worth his or her salt, he obviously closely observed people around him and peppered them with other characteristics to create fully rounded and totally believable characters." End quote. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you have yet to see From Beyond the Grave, you might want to give the next 20 minutes or so a miss. The stories adapted for the movie are, in order of appearance, The Gatecrasher, which stars David Warner and was scripted by Robin Clark, An Act of Kindness, which was scripted by Kevin Connor and stars Ian Bannen, Donald and Angela Pleasence and Diana Dors. The Elemental, scripted by Raymond Christodoulou and starring Ian Carmichael, Nairi Dawn Porter and Margaret Leighton. And finally The Door, again scripted by Robin Clark and starring Ian Ogilvy and Leslie Ann Down. These are linked by the framing device of a mysterious antique shop called Temptations Limited. This is run by Peter Cushing, delivering an incredibly dry commentary in the vein of the EC Comics Crypt Keeper, only this time with a Yorkshire accent. "I hope you enjoy snuffing it," he says to Ian Carmichael, and admonishes a disappearing Ian Bannen with the line, "Naughty, shouldn't have done that." Each of the characters buys, or in one case steals, an antique from Cushing's store, and then discovers that this act comes with a very heavy price to pay. This is with the exception of Ian Ogilvy, who, as it turns out, is the only honest customer and who manages to survive. Much like the EC Comics of the 1950s, this is horror with a moral compass, and the characters pay the ultimate price for their dishonesty. The film was described by writer Raymond Christodoulou as being all about karma, with Peter Cushing's character as the ultimate judge and jury. But to be fair though, perhaps the price they pay is rather disproportionate. David Warner lies about the value of an antique mirror and gets it for a fraction of the price. Ian Bannen steals some army medals to impress a street peddler, and Ian Carmichael swaps some price tags around to get himself a bargain. All very unethical, I'm sure you'll agree, but I'm not certain on balance that they deserve the murder, mayhem and supernatural shenanigans that are dealt out to them and the people they love. Even Ian Ogilvy's character, who, as I just mentioned, turns out to be completely honest, still has to endure a nightmarish battle with the undead figure of Sir Michael Sinclair, and he also has to destroy the door he has paid for quite fairly in order to survive. You could hardly blame him if he decided to report Cushing and Temptations Limited to trading standards. One of the criticisms of the Amicus movies, particularly when compared to Dead of Night, is that the linking narratives are fairly arbitrary, and there is also very little room for character development. This is something that was observed by the critic David Peary, who wrote about the movie in the Monthly Film Bulletin at the time of its release. Quote, "In general, the stale repetition of trite supernatural themes demonstrates the limitations of Amicus's basic approach, and the reason why, despite so many attempts, they have yet to come up with anything as good as Ealing's Dead of Night. A uniquely feeble linking story hinges together a script in which no attention at all is paid to character exposition or dialogue, with the result that everything is dependent on the limited visual suspense of the material." End quote. Personally, I think this is rather unfair. For me, From Beyond the Grave is the best of all the Amicus anthologies. These stories are by far the strongest, and the framing narrative is very well done. Also, to be fair to Subotsky, he wasn't trying to produce a picture along the lines of Dead of Night, despite his self-professed admiration for the earlier film. In his book Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film, Peter Hutchings quotes Milton Subotsky as being dismissive of the framing narratives in his own films, reporting that he usually cut those sections shorter and shorter because during editing he found them rather boring. And with the possible exception of their film Asylum, the framing device here is, in my opinion, one of the best ones that they came up with, certainly far better than those of Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror or Torture Garden, which, in my opinion, is the weakest of the anthology films overall. After the opening credits, which are accompanied by what seems to be a version of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, the film opens with David Warner entering the antique shop and haggling over the price of a mirror, an item which immediately recalls the third story in the 1940s anthology. Told that the price is £250, he argues that the item is not an antique at all, saying, quote, "Look at the glass, look at the back. It's been treated. I know my antiques. I'll tell you what, I'll give you 25 quid to get rid of it." End quote. Turning to leave, he is stopped by Cushing, who accepts his offer and tells him rather ominously, "It's a deal." And this, of course, is what I mean about the punishment being a little disproportionate. Warner has indeed been trying to push his luck, but Cushing himself didn't have to take the offer, suggesting that this is less about righteous karma and more about something far more sinister. We soon find out, of course, that Warner knew the real value of the mirror all along, and that his haggling was simply what he calls, quote-unquote, good business practice. One of his guests remarks that the mirror looks like something that belongs in a medium's parlour, which prompts Warner to suggest they have a séance. This brings us to perhaps one of the most famous scenes in the movie, the camera panning the faces of the participants as they hold hands at the circular table, a candle suddenly burning brightly as they summon forth the spirits. In the original story, the gatecrasher of the title turns out to be none other than Jack the Ripper, an element that was dropped from this adaptation altogether. Chetwynd Hayes was uncertain of this approach, saying that the sequence could have been improved by a little more conversation, and highlighting that the point that he tried to make in the story, that the face in the mirror was indeed Jack the Ripper, had been completely lost. The mirror is a portal to a dimension of the dead, a doorway through which they will re-enter the world and take seats of power. As the ghastly figure says, once he is made fully flesh, quote, "We sit in high places," end quote. Not having read the original story, I cannot say whether the source material ends in such a subversive manner, but to be honest, I'm really not sure that a reveal that he is Jack the Ripper would have made much of a difference in this version anyway. What this sequence certainly has is an impressive use of colour, with vibrant reds, fluorescent greens and swirling 1970s lighting pushing it closer to the work of Mario Bava. Cinematography for this film came courtesy of Alan Hume, who had worked on Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, as well as the Hammer movie Kiss of the Vampire in 1963. He had also worked on several of the British Carry On movies, and would go on to work on Return of the Jedi, as well as the Bond movies Octopussy and A View to a Kill. Warner's performance is what carries this section as he slips from arrogant city boy to a desperate and tortured victim, though it's fair to say he probably wouldn't have known much about it. Once when asked by an interviewer about his role in the film, he reportedly replied, "I don't know, I've never seen it. Am I any good?" This story is followed by my favourite one of the movie, indeed my favourite one of any Amicus films, and this is An Act of Kindness. This segment features terrific performances from Ian Bannen, Diana Dors and father and daughter Donald and Angela Pleasence, marking the only time they would appear on film together, something that Angela recalled as being rather intimidating. Quote, "I was nervous to start with. It was the first time I'd ever worked with him, and I was very young and not a very experienced actor, so I was a bit shy, but it turned out to be all right. And he, of course, was impeccably professional." End quote. And it has to be said that this piece of casting is inspired, adding an extra layer of creepiness to what is in fact already a fairly creepy story, something that was certainly noticed by Kevin Connor, who said in a later interview, quote, "Very creepy. And their eyes. Putting them side by side in a two-shot, what a spine-chilling effect that created. And both were wonderful actors, and so understanding and helpful to me, shooting my first movie." End quote. Of all of the stories in any of the Amicus movies, this one is probably the most deeply cynical. Christopher, played by Ian Bannen, is trapped in a loveless marriage and a dead-end job, and desperately tries to capture some sense of self-respect and much-needed admiration from his relationship with an ex-army peddler who sells shoelaces and matches outside of the train station. Connor was particularly happy with Bannen's performance, saying that he was a real pro and that he delivered such a faultless performance that it was exactly as the director saw it in his mind's eye. Christopher is the epitome of dreams gone to dust and promise unfulfilled, something that his wife Mabel takes great delight in reminding him of, calling him a jumped-up little clerk and bitterly laughing at her lot in life having married him. Played by former starlet and pin-up Diana Dors, Mabel is hardened and abusive, and their son Stephen snickers at both his parents behind their backs. Most hurtful of all, we discover at the end of this story that Emily and her father have in fact been magically summoned by Stephen, who clearly wants his parents out of the way and to escape the hostilities of home. "You see, Stephen," father and daughter tell him at the end, "we always answer children's prayers." The performances in this segment are the strongest in the movie. The initial silent exchange between Pleasence and Bannen regarding money in the tin cup is a masterclass in micro-expression and awkwardness, and the quiet reflection expressed by Dors when she comments that someone took her photograph shows that her character is far deeper than the simple harridan that she first appears. And Angela Pleasence as Emily steals the show as a terribly disquieting figure who hides a dark and feral nature beneath a veneer of childlike innocence. Her strongest moments include singing a disturbing lullaby in a very flat and atonal manner, and delivering a prediction of Christopher's marriage and future that is absolutely devastating. You hate her, she despises you. As the years race by, your life will become more miserable, for she will not improve with age. From this rather nasty slice of suburban life, and most certainly a rather nasty slice of wedding cake, we move on to some comic relief, though handled, in my opinion, much more successfully than the golfing story we barely spoke of earlier, and still with a decidedly nasty edge. Here, Ian Carmichael, possibly best known at this stage as the upper-class detective Lord Peter Wimsey, plays a suburban commuter who ends up with a demonic spirit called an elemental rooted to his shoulder. The humour in this sequence comes not from the situation, nor from Carmichael or his wife, played by Nairi Dawn Porter, but instead from the medium Madame Orloff, played by the actress Margaret Leighton in her last ever role. Sitting opposite him in a train carriage, she warns him of the spirit that has taken hold on his shoulder, and is so incredibly eccentric, there is very little wonder that he first ignores her. It is only when the dog runs away from home and his wife accuses him of attacking her in their marital bed that he begins to suspect that Madame Orloff might have been right. She arrives at his house to perform an exorcism, and this is about as far removed from Father Merrin in The Exorcist as it is possible to get. "Get out of it, you basket!" she shouts, while the room explodes around them. Co-star Nairi Dawn Porter remembers Leighton's performance incredibly well, recalling that despite the fact she was one of the greatest actors of her generation, she was always worried about remembering her lines. Despite this, Porter said, quote, "Her skill was beautiful. She suited that part brilliantly, and she was wonderful." End quote. The final story gives us a happy ending, and stars Ian Ogilvy, who by this point had become something of a fixture in British horror. As we discussed back in episode 2, he starred in all 3 of Michael Reeves' horror movies, The She-Beast, The Sorceress and Witchfinder General, and he'd also appeared in the Amicus full-length feature And Now the Screaming Starts, which was released in 1973. Kevin Connor had extremely positive memories of Ogilvy, calling the actor the most unpretentious man that he had ever met, either before or since, saying, "He's so talented, quiet, and always ready to shoot, word perfect. He and Leslie Ann Down made life very easy for me on my first movie." Leslie Ann Down was only 19 at the time of filming, but she had already appeared in Hammer movie Countess Dracula, playing Ingrid Pitt's daughter, and also in a rather sleazy British attempt at a giallo titled Assault, opposite Susie Kendall and Frank Finlay. Here Ogilvy plays the one decent character that visits Temptations Limited, in an instalment which also recalls the mirror story from Dead of Night. He and his wife Rosemary take possession of a door, which despite being fitted to a stationery cupboard in his office, acts as a portal to Clavering Grange, and through which Sir Michael reaches into this world to claim eternal life. This story also served as the inspiration for writer and director Mark Gatiss for his 3-part series Crooked House, a TV show that was aired on BBC Two in the run-up to Christmas 2008. But given that he is a self-proclaimed fan of classic British horror, I think this inspiration is hardly surprising. After Sir Michael is rather messily disposed of, we return to Temptations Limited, and a rather nasty surprise for a would-be burglar. Here it is revealed that Cushing's antique dealer is more than human, a trick that Amicus had already utilised at the climax of Dr. Terror and also Torture Garden. It's fairly predictable, but fortunately we are distracted from this by a breaking of the fourth wall, as Cushing delivers a brief monologue to camera. "My customers, Come in, come in. I'm sure I have the very thing to tempt you. Lots of bargains, all tastes catered for. Oh, and a big novelty surprise goes with every purchase. Do come in any time. I'm always open. And as the door swings shut behind him, we are greeted with a signage painted on the glass. Offers you cannot resist. From Beyond the Grave was released in the UK on February the 23rd, 1974, and did reasonable box office and received generally positive reviews. However, it was very much eclipsed by The Exorcist, which was released just a few weeks later, and which introduced a very different kind of horror. Even worse, in the US, it would sit on the shelf for 2 years, finally creeping into cinemas in 1976. The moment for classic British horror had very much been and gone. Despite this, some of the reviews were favourable, with Roger Ebert using its release to pine for the days of horror that scared rather than disgusted. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the box office returns were not as one might have hoped, and the Chicago Tribune clearly spelled out the reason, saying that an audience raised on a diet of The Exorcist, Jaws, and assorted other films would find From Beyond the Grave quaint and not very frightening. Following his movie debut, Connor would continue his directing career, particularly in the world of fantasy cinema, directing a series of films starring the actor Doug McClure. These include The Land That Time Forgot in 1974 and its direct sequel, The People That Time Forgot, that was released in 1977. Between these films, in 1976, they made At the Earth's Core, which reunited the director with Peter Cushing, and also co-starred Hammer actress and one-time Bond girl Caroline Munro. They followed this in 1978 with Warlords of Atlantis, and the two worked together once more in 1982 with the supernatural horror The House Where Evil Dwells. Being completely honest, none of these films have aged very well, mainly due to the incredibly low budgets and the very, very dated special effects. That being said, they do have a certain charm to them, though that might just be nostalgia for my own childhood. Perhaps more impressively though, in between Warlords of Atlantis and The House Where Evil Dwells, he directed the far more interesting Motel Hell, a comedy horror starring Rory Calhoun as an entrepreneur whose meat products contain a few unusual ingredients. And indeed, it was Connor's work on From Beyond the Grave that led to his being hired for the movie, which is often seen as a satire of backwards horror films. And while you may not be familiar with the film itself, I would imagine you've possibly seen its most famous image, Rory Calhoun wearing a pig's head and wielding a chainsaw. Although From Beyond the Grave is perhaps the most accomplished adaptation of Chetwynd Hayes' work, it is not the only one. In 1973, his short story Housebound was adapted by Rod Serling for the Anthology TV series Night Gallery. This was retitled Something in the Woodwork, and starred Geraldine Page as a woman who discovers that her attic is haunted by a bank robber and who uses the discovery to plan her husband's murder. In the same year, while From Beyond the Grave was still in production, he also had a story titled The Ninth Removal, adapted by the BBC for their radio series The Price of Fear, an anthology show starring Master of Horror Vincent Price. And then in 1981, his collection of short stories titled The Monster Club was adapted into an anthology movie of the same name. This had the linking framework of veteran actor John Carradine playing the author himself, taken to the titular nightclub by vampire Vincent Price, and treated to 3 stories about various monsters. I've got to be honest, in my opinion, this film is of a very low quality, and of the segments in the nightclub itself, the less said about those, the better. In 1989, both the Horror Writers of America and the British Fantasy Society presented our Chetwynd Hayes with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and he was also the special guest at the 1997 World Fantasy Convention in London. By this time though, he had begun to suffer with failing health, and in mid-2000 moved into a care home in Teddington, Middlesex. A year later, on March the 20th, 2001, he passed away from bronchial pneumonia. He was 81 years old. He once said, quote, "I am writing for the future. I hope in 100 years' time some editor will find one of my old books and decide it will fill up a gap, and so I shall live again. In that respect, I suppose being a writer is very much like being a vampire." End quote. And I'd like to think that with this episode, I might have introduced his work to one or two new readers, and that this has gone some way towards fulfilling that ambition. Dead of Night and From Beyond the Grave are of course two examples of anthology films, omnibus films or portmanteau movies, however you want to describe them. Both are peculiarly British and act as time capsules for an era long gone. They are also showcases for an incredible range of British acting talent, and have also acted as inspiration for several more modern works, including Inside Number 9, The League of Gentlemen, and, in my personal opinion, Black Mirror. As we discussed back in episode 11, Christopher Smith cited Dead of Night as a significant influence on his 2009 horror movie Triangle. Andy Nyman and Jeremy Dyson, the creators of the highly successful stage show Ghost Stories and its subsequent movie, have also referred to both films as being an influence, saying, quote, "They are utterly British and fantastically global, full of deliciously playful scares that creeped us out and stayed alive in our imaginations for decades." End quote. And although both films are respectively over 80 and 51 years old, there is still much to delight, entertain, and disturb within them. And if that isn't the mark of an effective horror movie, then I really don't know what is. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please do take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or any of the films we've discussed so far in the series, you can write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, our Christmas season continues with a return to the world of Val Lewton with Curse of the Cat People from 1944, starring Simone Simon, Kent Smith, Jane Randolph, and Elizabeth Russell. This film is the Christmas element of next week's duo and was directed by Robert Wise, who also directed the second film in our pairing, which is not, as you might have just supposed, The Sound of Music, but is instead The Haunting from 1963, starring Julie Harris, Richard Johnson, Russ Tamblyn, and Claire Bloom. If you want to watch along and you're in the UK, you can currently watch Curse of the Cat People completely free of charge with no commercials on the BBC iPlayer. And The Haunting is available for rental on YouTube, Google Play Movies, Sky Store, Apple TV, and Amazon Prime. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. And until then, thank you once again for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.